After living in Mexico for over a year, I concluded my trip by flying to Houston, Texas to get vaccinated. Then, more than 2 weeks were spent traveling through El Salvador and a mini visit to Costa Rica. Eventually, it was time to return to Canada and perhaps take a long-awaited break from travel. But that wasn't meant to be. Despite traveling for the past 8 years, visiting over 60 countries and over 150 cities, I barely knew the country that I grew up in, Canada. I probably didn't explore Canada because metaphorically, I thought the grass would be greener and more interesting on the other side of the planet. But then, while exploring Mexico, I met a cute girl from Montreal, the French part of Canada. This gave me a strong enough reason to finally start making plans for visiting parts unknown. So, even before landing back home, I was already making plans to get everything organized and booked for a small cross-country tour of Canada, from Toronto to Ottawa to Montreal, and finally, Quebec City.
Bonjour et bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Today we're going to go to first Ottawa, then to Montreal, and then to Quebec City. Hoy nos vamos por algunos lugares, Ottawa, Montreal y Ciudad de Quebec. And we are going to take my 2001 Ford Taurus, this bad boy, while she still runs. And we're going to ride around once we get there. Lots of museums, lots of destinations, lots of things to see. También tenemos un electro scooter. We also have an electric scooter, so we're going to take this and ride around as much as we can and explore the cities instead of walking. And also, I'm learning French. So, bonjour, bonsoir. Qu'est-ce que vous voudriez manger? Je veux manger quelque chose, s'il vous plaît. Mesdames et messieurs, à demain. Hasta luego.
But within 2 weeks of preparing for my adventure, the girl who I'd prepared to visit in Montreal had decided to leave Canada. Regardless, exploring Canada was still the main objective. Since I hadn't ventured far past Toronto, everything was new and interesting. The sheer beauty and curiosity of a landscape I should have already discovered after over 2 decades of living in Canada. But in reality, I knew almost nothing. While Google Maps recommended a quick path on a long but fairly boring highway that I was quite familiar with, I decided to take a gamble and pass by a more scenic route through partial farmland with a quick intersection in a small town along the way. Arriving in Ottawa. Upon arriving in Ottawa, I parked my car on the sidewalk, checked in, unloaded most of my things in my room, and confirmed that my car would not be towed. Luckily, it was Sunday, so street parking was free. I equipped my Sony Alpha 6600 camera, threw on a cowboy hat, and hopped onto my Segway electric scooter to start rolling around Ottawa for a fun video and photo taking session. Ottawa, despite being the political capital of Canada, isn't an enormous city and hosts only about 1.4 million people in the Greater Ottawa area. Most businesses here either serve the political elite or they serve the enormous influx of tourists every spring and summer. More than 150 years ago, Ottawa was just a small trading outpost for lumber and other goods. But eventually, Ottawa was declared as the capital of the Dominion of Canada by the Queen of England. Ottawa was located in a dense region of forest and on top of a hill. This location was much more defensible against the looming threat of the post-revolutionary United States. While riding around, you could feel the cultural significance of Ottawa with its high density of universities, historic and political structures, and monuments dedicated to various causes and important events throughout Canadian history.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. J'arrive à Ottawa. Right now, we're going to see the Parliament. So what is this? This is the unfortunate murder of many, many children of Indigenous descent here in Canada. There have been a total of 1,000 bodies thus far discovered recently, which is on top of the thousands of bodies that are probably missing somewhere as well.
Yet, outside the highly touristic areas, the city is quite calm, almost sleepy as you venture through the suburbs. But despite being the political heart of the great nation of Canada, which is perceived as one of the top destinations for immigration, I couldn't help but notice the moderate amount of homeless people and the occasional drug addicts in the center of the city. Just outside the window of my hostel, I would see the occasional group of 3 or 4 addicts shooting up in broad daylight, just 2 kilometers from the main centers of government. But that's another social issue altogether. Furthermore, being the political center of Canada, it wasn't hard to miss a protest. Whether it was for the abuse and murder of Indigenous children by the Catholic Church that occurred across hundreds of years, or protests for relaxing rules against illegal immigration. Despite Ottawa having the infrastructure and political will of a big city, ultimately it felt like a small town with a very relaxed vibe, a place that one could come and retire for a while. Yet, just across the river was the even sleepier town of Gatineau, located in the French province of Canada called Quebec. Thanks to my trusty electric scooter, I was able to cover up to 60 kilometers of distance, thus allowing me to briefly explore this town as well. The old historic core, which felt almost like a frontier town or a village out of the Wild Wild West, wasn't active when I went, but I could imagine it would make a fun pub crawl on certain nights. Riding around Gatineau, I felt like I was transported into a 1980s Canada with its unimaginative minimalist office complexes and single-family houses from an even older era. After about 2 hours of riding around the supposed downtown of Gatineau, I made my way back across another bridge to Ottawa, briefly stopping at a Holocaust memorial. After 2 days of exploring the big town of Ottawa, it was time to venture into the globally recognized French part of Canada. Arriving in Quebec. Upon crossing into the French province of Quebec, you feel like you're in an alternate reality of Canada. Everything looks the same as your typical Canada. The buildings, the people, the roads, the infrastructure, yet everything is in the French language. Every country I traveled to, there wasn't a single person I spoke with that didn't know about the distinctly French-speaking part of Canada. Everyone knew that an entire part of Canada was dedicated to speaking French instead of English. Luckily, I spent a good 2 weeks relearning French using Pimsleur French. During this entire road trip, I would actively listen and repeat the lessons in my car and while riding around on my electric scooter. Bonjour madame, comment allez-vous? Est-ce que vous voudriez boire quelque chose avec moi ce soir? Furthermore, I had a general grasp of Spanish and Portuguese. Thus, it was amazing to hear the similarities in languages, ultimately making French just a bit easier to understand. So, by the time I arrived in Montreal, I had a minimal and functional amounts of French in my vocabulary. But either way, it didn't matter, since everyone I interacted with spoke fluent English. Exploring Montreal. Upon driving into Montreal, my immediate first impressions was that I was back in a big city, with a massive towering skyscrapers, complex intersecting highways, and the endless houses that adorned the surrounding landscapes. To avoid blowing through money and potentially meet other travelers, I stayed at a hostel in the downtown area and parked my car in a location with free parking. Once again, I threw on my camera, hopped onto my electric scooter, and started exploring. Montreal Day 1. Almost within 50 meters of my hostel was a park that seemed a bit sketchier and more dangerous than I had expected. I tried to make some photos, but was immediately confronted by drug addicts who told me to stop taking photos at risk for myself and the thousands of dollars of equipment I was riding around with. I replied with questions, but ultimately my aim was to defuse the situation and continue on my way with nothing stolen. Riding around Montreal felt like a massive city had completely swallowed the historic past of important political and cultural institutions. Montreal featured old housing complexes built in the early 1900s, yet was completely overshadowed by the modern gentrified skyscrapers and office buildings. But the most interesting part was Old Montreal. You suddenly feel like you're transported to the old world of Europe. Riding around this deeply historic core of Old Montreal felt surreal. After living in Canada for more than 2 decades, I had little realization that Canada had something so historic and well-preserved hidden away. Unlike Toronto, which is dotted with the occasional culturally significant architecture, Old Montreal is a relic city within a modern city and one of the highlights of Montreal. After exploring the historic center for a bit and buying a small souvenir to commemorate that I've been here, I continued along the shore of the St. Lawrence River and enjoyed the skyline as it transformed back into either minimalist office buildings or massive gentrified condominiums for the newly rich. A quick stop in the Atwater market brought a nostalgia of Mexico, Latin America, and the developing world. As I continued towards the downtown core, I took a note of the French and Western European palatial-like homes melded in with the more recent build-and-quick style developments. One of the wonderful things about Montreal in the summer is its relative walkable accessibility, especially in the center of the city. You could walk from one area to the other without anyone ever bothering you or ever feeling like you could have a safety concern. The streets were alive with locals and tourists walking around to and from their destinations or simply enjoying the very low-risk reality of a Canadian city. Most, if not all of the streets in Montreal were clean and well-maintained, and the right-of-way on the streets between pedestrians and vehicles was naturally enforced by a strong Canadian culture of safety and hospitality. The pedestrians, or even tourists on electric scooters, would always have the right-of-way for any crossing at any time, unlike my experiences in Latin America, for example. I made my way through the towering blocks of the downtown core towards the massive green lawns of McGill University to start making my way up the hill that represents the name of the city, Montreal, or Royal Mountain. The importance of this university could be deduced by how much area of the central downtown core it took up, as well as the marvelously historic faculty buildings that adorned its campus. Unlike in Latin America, where entry into university is strictly limited to students and staff due to safety issues, here in Montreal, you could simply venture into the campus and enjoy a peaceful day amongst the other students who were either studying, reading, or playing sports. Eventually the sun was setting and my scooter battery was nearing the 20% mark, so I started my way back down from the university on top of Montreal, back through the relaxing streets. I would come across a small street that had restaurants and bars on all sides, and even a fun little foam fountain. But then the battery died and it was time to call it a day. Montreal, day 2. The following day had an overcast of clouds and rain, but this didn't stop me from my mission of venturing to the very top of Montreal. Before starting the adventure, I went back to my car and noticed that the door was half open. Looking inside, I noticed that someone had unlocked my door and started looking for things to steal. Fortunately, all I had were basic car documents in the front, and the potential thief didn't bother checking the trunk of the car, which had more valuable assets. Regardless, after a quick reorganization of my car, I hopped back on my scooter and started the adventure to the top of Montreal. Here would be the most amazing view of the city, and the view that most people would probably recommend most and remember most within Montreal. Only up here did I realize the enormous size of Montreal and how much territory I would need to cover to really get a grasp of the city, while at the same time planning my next points of interest to visit. A fascinating perspective was to distinguish between the different generations of buildings that had been erected. You could see everything from the University of Montreal, McGill, built centuries ago, to the hotels built 100 years ago, to the very boring and minimalist office complexes of the 60s and 70s, into the newer generation of tall and narrow glass-covered gentrified apartments that feature rooms the size of closets while offering pools, gyms, stores as concessions for their inhabitants. Visiting the top of Montreal was one of the highlights of this trip.
All right, what up? Leonidas here, coming in from Montreal. And although this isn't my first time here, this is actually my third time in Montreal. The first 2 times I wasn't here on my own terms. I wasn't here at my own pace. Pretty much just came here to do work-related things. The first time was to sell contracts door to door for gas and electricity. And the second time I came here was to go to the festival, Osheaga, for a music festival, to work at the festival itself. But ultimately, I never really got to see the city, nor explore it, nor meet any of the people within Montreal. And one thing I'd like to say is that if you travel to a city, at least have some time and stay there for at least a minimum of 3 days to say that you were honestly there. Because otherwise, if it's so transient that you go to a location and then you say ultimately you check it off on the list of things to do, then any less than 3 days would be a disservice to saying that you were actually there.
At this point, I managed to arrange a date with a local girl in Montreal, so it was time to speed my way back to the hostel. As you go down the mountain, you venture through green parks and eventually exit through a back-end road that is overshadowed by a massive cemetery. I visited many cemeteries on my adventures. from the cemeteries in Buenos Aires in Argentina, to Samarkand in Uzbekistan, to Sao Paulo in Brazil, and in Mexico City. Each has their distinctive cultural design to commemorate the passing of loved ones. But also the sheer scale of these cemeteries is eye-opening, with each tombstone featuring something unique to read, observe, or take note of. As I made my way back to the hostel, I crossed into the territory of the upper class with their extravagantly large homes, perfectly trimmed gardens, and cars that were safely tucked away in their 2 to 3 space garages. Eventually, I made it back to my hostel, dropped off my scooter for charging, and went on a date for the rest of the evening with a Persian girl from Iran who now lives in Montreal. Montreal, day 3. The third day of exploring Montreal consisted of pure sunshine and discovery. The other side of town had several points of interest I wanted to visit, including the Jacques Cartier Bridge, St. Helens Island with its amusement park, and even the Olympic Stadium. With a fully charged scooter battery, a fully charged camera, phone, and some sunscreen, I began the adventure. Riding through the streets of Montreal is a lot of fun because there are bike lanes on almost every street, thus allowing for rapid electric scooter dodging and weaving. And one of the fascinating things I really loved about Montreal was how certain streets were designed strictly for walking. Entire roads where people could casually walk all summer long and observe certain parts of the city without the loud annoyances of motors, honking, and buses. These streets would be filled with chairs for restaurants and decorations to spice up the atmosphere. Over the 3 days that I was here, I would discover at least 5 streets like this in Montreal that were dedicated purely for walking around. Eventually, venturing up to the Jacques Cartier Bridge gave a different view of Montreal, from wide esplanades for driving to the important industrial factories and cargo trains that wrap around the St. Lawrence River. Despite the downtown core looking like your typical financial hub and of office-related services, the factories along the St. Lawrence River reminds you of the old world industries that fueled the lifeblood of Montreal. I spent the day riding across the bridge for another amazing perspective of the city, then rode onto the island for some quick scenic viewing. Then I passed by the amusement park just to see how Quebecers entertain themselves during the summertime. Then I got back onto the bridge and made my way towards the Olympic Stadium. Passing through the Midtown Montreal was a blast as well. 3-story homes and businesses with the usual schools, churches, and shops interspersed. This felt more like your typical Toronto Midtown areas, but with a lot of the rapid gentrification into new condominiums you would see in major cities around the world. Eventually, I arrived at the Olympic Stadium, rode around a little bit, and sat down for a quick rest. Montreal is the only Canadian city that has hosted the Summer Olympics, and while the stadium looks absolutely beautiful with its spaceship-like design, the construction of the stadium put Montreal into massive amounts of debt for more than a decade. After a couple circles around the stadium, it was time to start making my way back towards my hostel. Along the way, I would pass through a long stretch of road that was dedicated strictly for residents and visitors to wander around restaurants, shops, and enjoy a nice sunny day in the middle of Montreal. I arrived back in my hostel in the evening and took a several-hour recharge break before making one final nighttime tour of Montreal. I quickly hopped into Old Montreal, visiting the Ferris wheel at the pier, and ultimately ending up at the St. Joseph's Oratory before the scooter battery reached 5% and shut off. At this point, I casually pushed my scooter by foot to my hostel, the remaining 7 kilometers, until finally passing out in my room. Quebec City. The next day, I got up around 10 a.m., loaded up my car, and drove the remaining 2.5 hours towards Quebec City. This was a city within Canada I knew practically nothing about. Yet, this was the one city in Canada that completely blew my expectations. When I was young, my father, coming from the older European world of St. Petersburg in Russia, mentioned one day that Canada didn't have much culture. The city landscapes of Canada primarily consist of shopping plazas, massive cookie-cutter or replica housing developments, and gas stations. It was only during and after visiting the immensely beautiful European cities or the colonial capitals and towns of Latin America, or the massive temple compounds of Asia, or even the gorgeously palace-like city of St. Petersburg in Russia did I really understand what he was comparing Canada to. But then I arrived in Quebec City. Day 1 in Quebec City. Once again, not wanting to blow through hundreds of dollars on a hotel and wanting to meet other travelers, I decided to stay in a hostel. Upon arriving, you are immediately immersed into something incredibly historic. Just around the corner from my hostel were the Plains of Abraham. These plains featured an enormous fort called the Citadel of Quebec, dedicated to protecting the French against the English during the 7 Years' War. Despite the French putting up a valiant defensive effort, the English eventually captured the fort along with Quebec City. But then, just downhill from the fort, you are transported into Old Europe, an experience I had never expected, especially within Canada. Everything felt incredibly colonial. But instead of the usual Spanish colonial, which I had become accustomed to within Latin America, this instead was a version of French colonialism. The roads were no longer in grid-like formats, but instead organized from a time when colonists, military, and religious ministers would set up a station on whatever patch of land was available in whatever direction made sense in the moment due to strategy, religious, or practical reasons. In between narrow cobble streets, flanked by 3-story homes, you encounter parks featuring either statues of important historical figures or the occasional military cannons. There were the occasional hotels that seemed to have been planted here during a simpler time of building code regulations. Later in the evening, I decided to venture to the lower town of Quebec City to explore my very first fancy boutique vegan restaurant at Dawn Vegan. Then, back on the scooter, I began to make my way to the old Quebec City port. Thankfully, this area had lots of plaques that explained the history of the old port and how it evolved over time. As the sun continued to set, I made my way back from the old port back to lower Quebec City and then to upper Quebec City. From here, I enjoyed a quick light show of the port and finally back to the hostel for a quick recharge. As the night progressed, I decided to head back into the old town to explore just a bit more. Nighttime featured beautiful light decorations as tourists walked around looking for a place to drink. A bit further out, I would cross one of the most beautiful structures in Quebec City, the Parliament Building Museum. While at this hour it was closed, the statues adorning the facades were beautiful and intrigued me with a curiosity to know who these important personalities were. Eventually, it was too dark to venture any further, so I rode back to the hostel. That night, the hostel became a weekly bar for students that felt practically like a fraternity party. I had one drink, chatted with a couple of locals, and finally called it a night. Day 2 in Quebec City. The following day, I made my way back to the best view of Quebec City at the Terrace of Saint Denis.
All right, so a quick update. I am now in Quebec City. I hope it's not too windy with the audio quality. Nonetheless, this city is very unexpectedly European, and I completely did not know that there would be so much European-esque architecture. So for the most part, I have to say that Quebec City is among the top 2 most beautiful cities in all of Canada, in the sense that here in Quebec City, the architecture is extremely beautiful, and the old town, the fort, as they would call it, is extremely well-maintained and, as I said, very European-esque, from, I would presume, a French flair, for obvious reasons, because Quebec is the French part of Canada. The other beautiful city in Canada would be Vancouver. So it's either Vancouver or Quebec as being the most beautiful cities in all of Canada. Vancouver has its own charm, its own feel. Vancouver has way more nature, I would say, but Quebec City is definitely surprisingly extremely beautiful and just very nice city. Highly recommend if you ever come to Canada, visit Quebec City, and then also visit Vancouver if you have a chance. And then obviously the typical ones, Toronto as well.
At this point, you definitely won't miss the giant Chateau Frontenac hotel that is featured as the hallmark representation of Quebec City. The first phase of this hotel was completed in 1893 by the Canadian Pacific Railway Company during a time that saw massive railway expansions. Thus, the company thought it would be a great idea for wealthy citizens and visitors to stay in a hotel in style. Eventually, I decided to make my way down, again, to the lower levels of Quebec City. You end up entering an even older part of Quebec City called Little Champlain Street, named after its founder, Samuel Champlain, who was one of the first Europeans to arrive in this area many centuries ago. This street is even more narrow than those of Upper Old Quebec City, yet it was densely packed with boutique shops and restaurants. At this point, I had to get off my scooter due to the density of tourists and to embrace the vibrance of colors and historical intrigues. I honestly felt like I was in a small town in France with the petite coffee shops, stone fountains, cobblestone streets, and tourists doing people watching as they waited for their drink and food orders. Escaping from this dense village of old European history, I hopped back onto my scooter and made my way along the St. Lawrence River, trying to find a way back to the upper town. The only option, it seemed, was to carry my scooter up a massive flight of stairs.
All right, so I have to go and take this scooter, right, up these stairs. This is the longest stairs, historic stairs in all of Quebec City. So this is going to be a pain in the ass. Let's give it a try. All right, we're halfway up. And still have all this. All right, todo bien, we made it. Scooter and Leo. That was a long ass staircase. Salute.
Upon getting to the top, I ventured through the Joan of Arc Gardens, named after a very famous hero of France, before heading back to the hostel to end the evening. Later in the evening, I randomly made my way back down to the Lower Quebec Street and across to St. Joseph Street. This felt more like a typical European shopping center, with boutique shops on the left and right, with a large boardwalk for pedestrians. Afterwards, I doubled back to the old Quebec City to enjoy the atmosphere just a bit more, before finally deciding to call it a day. Back to Ottawa. The following day, I packed all of my things, loaded up my scooter, and jumped back into the Adventure Mobile. But because it was the weekend, I had a friend who wasn't working and was available in Ottawa. So I decided to drop in for one more day instead of driving the full 6 to 8 hours back home to Toronto. Upon arriving in Ottawa, it was the weekend, sunny, warm, and beautiful. At this point, I discovered how lively the Byward Market is. My buddy and I met up, chatted for a bit, had a few drinks, and then I ventured off into the sunset. Back home to Toronto. The next day, for whatever reason, I had a desire to conclude my trip with a quick stopover in Prince Edward County, just 2.5 hours outside of Toronto. This was another region I knew nothing about, but decided it would be a nice cherry to end the adventure. The destination in this case was the sandbanks of Prince Edward County that had developed through various geological circumstances over thousands of years. But after about an hour or so, my desire for novelty had subsided, so the final destination was a straight highway ride back home. In conclusion, when I began this trip, I wasn't looking for anything specific within Canada. I simply wanted to give Canada a level of adventure and exploration I had given to countries such as Brazil, Mexico, Russia, Thailand, the Philippines, and many more. While this was an absolute fraction of the places I wanted to visit, and a fraction of the time that I wanted to invest into this adventure, it was definitely a great start. Since this was the peak of a typical Canadian summer, visiting Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City felt incredibly romantic and accommodating. And thankfully, my 2001 Ford Taurus was still in top shape during this journey. Yet, even before arriving back home, I was already planning for a future trip even further east, perhaps all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland, on the absolute coast of Canada. Perhaps one day this might happen. And that concludes my mini road trip within Canada. If you enjoyed that video, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, maybe share your experiences within Canada, and I will see you in the next video. Leonard is here, and salute.